Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the History Archive by Noah.beier. This is a history podcast in which I discuss all sorts of themes out of relative recent history, round about the past 120 years, and how they shaped our current world and also changed history. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing railways, a theme more out of civil engineering, as the past two episodes have been mainly about military engineering, as we talked about the evolution of underwater warfare. We talked about the early stages of submarines like the Turtle and the Hunley, and also what roles their respective developmental submarines played in World War I and II, and in the second episode we talked about the USS Nautilus. And if you haven't listened to those episodes, go listen to them. The episodes should be out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and also all episodes are uploaded to YouTube, so you can also listen to them there. And if you want to stay updated, I have a WhatsApp channel where you can keep up about all the developments and new episodes airing and the dates. I've left a link to that in the description or the show notes, depending on where you are listening to this. Okay, as always in this podcast, I would like to present a book that I used for research and which I think is a valuable asset to read on further about a theme, to find out more if you are interested by this episode. And today I would like to present the book. It's just called Train, ironically. The Definitive Visual History. It was created in a partnership between DK Books and the Smithsonian Museum. Most of you will probably know it. It is a collection of pictures and small text of extraordinary amount of different locomotives and engines that changed railways, and also important personalities that came into play over the years, like Isambard Brunel and Sir Nigel Gresley and others. Yeah, that is the book that I would like to advise you to read if you want to gather more information about what we talk about in today's episode. Of course, all my sources are linked below. Also this book, I've also put down a link where you can go get it, and I am not earning any money with this. Okay, let's get started with the episode. The first ever steam locomotive was built by an Englishman called Richard Trevithick, with a background in mining engineering, and his first locomotive was built in 1803. It was used to haul freight out of quarries on a 15-kilometer long track. The engine unfortunately fractured the iron rails at some point in time, but the engine itself had proved the concept of a steam engine on wheels that could pull freight. Unfortunately, this engine came around about 30 years too early, and so Richard Trevithick's invention never reached a market where it could be sold and make money. So unfortunately, the inventor of the steam engine died pennilessly in London in 1833. But his idea stayed around, and in 1830, the world's first intercity railway connection for passengers was opened to the public. So let's take a deep dive into the history of railways in Britain and how it changed the course of history in England. So The Industrial Revolution changed a lot all over Europe, not just in England. The main contributor to this was, of course, the steam engine. It could not only be used for driving a steam locomotive, it could be used in all sorts of applications. One of the applications were, of course, factories. Others were collieries and mines and quarries to get the minerals out of the ground and to daylight. Most factories were, of course, located in cities. And for factories, you need workers. Pre-Industrial Revolution, most people lived in very rural areas. Things were manufactured by local manufacturers, and not a whole lot was imported from elsewhere. Not a large amount of machinery was used to produce anything. Most was done by hand or with relatively primitive tools. So there was not a big need for people in the city. But now with the Industrial Revolution and factories, people were needed in the city as workmen in the factories. And if you're going to have lots of people moving into the city, you're going to need more houses. So for houses you need material. And where does this material come from? From mines and quarries from the countryside. For the example in this episode, I'm going to mainly talk about slate, but you could do very similar things with clay, which you would use to burn bricks and other materials. So slate was the number one roofing material. It was very resistant to water. It was not as maintenance heavy as roofs covered with wreaths, which was the primary roofing method before the Industrial Revolution. That was very maintenance heavy. You had to always keep on top of it, and that was of course not a very good way of going about building a large amount of houses in bigger cities, because with so many houses you can't keep on top of all those roofs, so they have to be reliably roofed with a material that doesn't need constant maintenance, and slate was a very good option there. It was also not very expensive, and best of all, Britain, or more precisely Wales, had a very large supply of slate under the ground. The only question is how to get it out. So large mines were built in the Welsh mountains. These mines were of course located high up in the mountains, and the material needed to get down the mountain to an exchange point with a harbour, or later with a other railway. As I just said, narrow gauge track was laid, 2 foot. Normal standard gauge at the time was 4 foot. So why was 2 foot narrow gauge chosen? In order to get up the mountain with at first horses and later locomotives, you need to lay the track not extremely steeply, otherwise the horses won't get up the mountain. It will just be too steep and the drag of the train will be too large. So you have to gradually wide up the mountain in circles. So this requires cutting tunnels and embankments and cuttings, all methods to remove ground to lay a track. And this is of course far more labor intensive if you have to make a 4 foot track bed instead of a 2 foot track bed. So it was basically just a way of saving work and manual labor. At the time, of course, bulldozers were still very far away, so most of this was done with spades and other hand tools. So the 2 foot gauge was laid. 2 foot gauge track was laid, and the railway actually predated the steam engine. So the railway was there, and the empty slate wagons would be pulled up the mountain by a horse. And once the trucks had arrived at the top of the mountain, the trucks would be packed tightly with the slate coming out of the mine, and then would just roll down the hill without any sort of motive power except, of course, gravity. The horse would then also travel down in a specially constructed wagon, so the horses could pull the train back up the mountain. The only problem was the effectivity of the horses. A horse could pull 10 empty slate wagons. And this was not enough, as the Industrial Revolution was gathering speed. So 10 wagons were not enough to load at once. The huge demand for slate coming in because of the need for roofing material in the cities was too large for horse-drawn trains. So railways began to invest in engines, in steam engines that could pull trains up to 100 empty slate wagons. So for example, in the year of 1863, the Ffestiniog Railway, one of the premier slate lines in Wales, introduced Prince, a saddle tank engine, and I have left a picture below show notes, and for those of you watching this on YouTube, the picture is on the screen. The 2-foot track also allowed for tighter curves to be negotiated while climbing the mountain, because it is easier to bend the track. This technological innovation led to an increase in the size of slate mines, collieries and quarries. Conditions in these were bad, for the dust produced by coal, or even worse, slate, affected the lungs and the overall health of the 17,000 workmen employed in the Welsh slate industry alone. This led to the formation of the trade unions, for instance, and in other countries, for instance in Germany, it led to the formation of health insurances. Trade unions for workers had the advantage that they could together go on strike in a large formation, which gave them influence. At first, trade unions were forbidden, but later the liberal and conservative governments in different stages legalized the trade unions and similar movements because of large protests in the country. Trade unions would later go on to together formate what we today know as the Labour Party. There were many other railways in Wales that transported slate. One of these was the Tallyllyn Railway. This line actually inspired Wilbert Awdry's stories about the Skarloey Railway in the Railway series, a series which would later be turned into the famous TV series Thomas and Friends. The Tallyllyn Railway was not as productive as other railways of the time, but after the slate businesses were basically dead due to the use of alternative roofing material, the owner of the quarry and the line, Sir Henry Hayden Jones, kept the railway and the mines running to prevent a huge wave of unemployment in the area. This would be inevitable if the mine and the railway closed altogether. At the time, they were making little to no profit at all, and as such, the railway had to do with the 1866 equipment, which was the original equipment from day one. And this was still being used in the year 1945. So after Sir Henry Hayden Jones died, a preservation society was formed to keep the railway running, and this would lay the template for many other preservation societies and other preserved railways in England. The Talyllyn was the first of this kind, at least at the narrow gauge scale. So transporting minerals from the mine, like the Talyllyn Railway or the Festiniog Railway, to a harbour was not the only function of a railway. There was, of course, the large sector of passenger transport, which we, of course, know today most primarily, and also the transport of goods across the country. In the 19th century, there were around about 120 different railways running on standard gauge throughout England. The first of these had been the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, operated by an engine called the Rocket. The Rocket had laid the template for all other steam engines to come, like the Prince or the Talyllyn engines. Several aspects had made the Rocket quite revolutionary. For starters, the boiler had several tubes that ran the length of it. The boiler is the large, round thing in the middle, if you want. It contains the water that is boiled. Now, if you add tubes to it that are open at both ends, one end is opened into the firebox, the area behind the boiler, in which you have a fire that burns very brightly and with a very high temperature to make the water boil. So if you have tubes, the heat has more contact area with the inside of the boiler. So if the heat then travels to the inside of the tubes along the length of the boiler, the water has more contact area with the heat, so the heating is more effective, and the heating also runs the length of the boiler. The other end of the tube opens in the so-called smoke box. The excess steam coming from the cylinders that comes from the boiler through the cylinders, that is then used by the cylinders to move the engine, also enters the smoke box from below. So the hot steam shoots upwards through the smoke box out of the funnel. This creates a sucking effect on the tubes. So air is pulled, the hot air from the firebox is pulled through the tubes, which creates a draft on the fire. Because the underside of the firebox is not shut off, but is created with fire bars, so bars that are laid at intervals into the firebox. There's air coming up from below the firebox, and this is then also sucked in, creating a constant airflow on the firebox, which of course makes the fire burn even more consistently and even hotter, which increases the effectivity of the coal used and the water used, which is of course critical if you want to run an economically viable railway. Okay, so as I just said before I explained the mechanics of the Rocket, there were 120 railways at one point in Britain. This was just shortly after World War I. In 1921, the House of Commons passed the Railway Act of 1921, which is also called the Grouping Act. This had the effect that all the 120 railways would be grouped into 4 areas. These 4 areas would then be run by 4 companies. So none of the railways would have actual competition, which would help the railway economy to grow. We'll also come to some of the goods transportation aspects of this in a moment. So the act was taken into effect in 1923, and the 3 areas then corresponded to the 4 companies: the LNER, the London North Eastern Railway, which operated the northeastern part, connecting them to London; the Southern Railway, which operated all the areas south of London; the Great Western Railway, which operated the western parts west of London; and the LMS, the London Midland Scotland, which took also its reach into Scotland, and also part of the east of England. So this created, of course, passenger traffic options, so you could now travel with unified prices all across England. It made it easier because you didn't have to switch from different railways, and it also defeated the problem of 2 railways building parallel lines, which was a waste of money. So this would save money for all the railways and make it easier to transport passengers and goods. That was the idea of grouping the railways. This system stayed established until the breakout of World War II, where the railways were all grouped together and governed by a central committee. And after World War II, this system was basically adopted, and all railways were grouped together into British Railways. So before we finish today's episode, I would like to talk about another aspect of the railways. We have now talked about transporting minerals via narrow gauge, and a little bit about passenger traffic. But another big aspect is transporting goods across the country. And this also brought about a revolution, as I previously already touched on slightly when I said before the Industrial Revolution, most products were made in local workshops by only a few people working in a workshop with relatively primitive tools. The Industrial Revolution now gave big factories the possibility not only to produce goods on a huge scale, it also provided them with the opportunity to transport them to the most remote areas of the country. This introduced standardization and fueled our modern consumer age, because it was easier than ever to buy products in shops that were delivered to by big factories, bringing in their products at a relatively cheap price, because mass production lowers the price, which of course brought in a lot of money for the companies producing these consumer products, but it also of course gave a huge boom to the railways transporting these goods. Whole classes of engines were built mainly to pull goods trains, which just goes to show the importance that goods traffic had for the railways and the companies, and also of course for the consumers in the villages and more rural areas, and also in the cities, where of course also products were needed, and even more. So the entire way of living was changed, because it was now cheaper to buy things, and they were more readily available. So not only did the way people live change, because they were now primarily not living in the countryside, but in the city with slate-roofed houses, but also the goods they used in their everyday life. So this was a little outtake out of what the rise of railways made possible in Britain. Now this was my example for today's episode, but you can also transfer most of this to other countries in Europe and possibly also other parts of the world. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I would be very happy if you subscribe to the podcast or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel and the WhatsApp channel to stay up to date with episode releases and other stuff. And I hope to see you in the next episode of the History Archive. My name is Noah.beier. Bye!